watched the movie Soy Cuba the other day. That is what I'm excited to talk about today. Um, it was a movie made in Cuba. It was a movie made in Cuba after the events of the Cuban Revolution. So it shows first Batista's Cuba, Cuba under the U.S. backed dictator. And then it shows Cuba during and a little bit after the revolution. So part of what it's about is Batista's forces suppressing the Cuban people. Batista's forces killing Cuban communists for publishing education pamphlets, for doing political organizing. And it showed how Havana, Cuba, was basically like a brothel and a casino for American capitalists before the revolution. While the countryside, the people, the peasants lived in extreme poverty. So it was really, really incredible movie. It's from the 60s, subtitled, so it was a little slow, but it had some incredible music and cinematography. So we'll talk about that. Sickle Me Pink says, hello, Midwestern Marks. Hello, Sickle Me Pink. Killer Finland is here sending emotes. Welcome, Killer Finland. New emotes coming soon. A gangster dwelling under Batista. Exactly. It was a home for wealthy gangsters and capitalists. So I'll pull up a trailer for the movie and I can get right into reviewing it at the beginning of the stream here. So the opening 5 minutes were pretty incredible. It shows Havana, Cuba. Oh wow! When I searched Soy Cuba, our video popped up, or our live popped up. That's funny. But here's like an example of what Cuba was like prior to the revolution, which is something that this movie highlights and shows. It shows the contrast between what life is like for the Cuban peasants, the majority of Cuban people, the workers, versus what life was like in Havana for the wealthy capitalists and gangsters. This would be in the 1950s. The revolution happened in 1959. This is cool, but I'm going to skip forward to Havana. So basically, this part of the movie shows the capitalists in Havana, the people who own the fields, the plantations that the Cuban workers are working in, partying in Havana, and there's a lot of talk about brothels and prostitution, and these capitalists using Cuban women who are forced to sell their bodies because of the economic conditions, using those women exploiting them sexually for money. Which was extremely popular in the capital of Cuba, and it really shows the contrast of you have people working in the fields, families of impoverished Cubans working in the fields. And one of the first things that happens in this movie is one of the capitalists goes to the house of a prostitute that he meets at a club in Havana. And he goes back to the house and sees the poverty that the Cuban people are living in. Sees the lack of shelter and children with lack of electricity, with lack of all the things that Americans are used to in industrial society, especially wealthy Americans. And he's shocked at the poverty, and it's a really, really well shot scene. It makes you feel really claustrophobic, like the capitalist is just freaking out, being surrounded by poverty everywhere he goes after he's exploited this Cuban woman. So, yeah, incredible scene. So yeah, that gives you an idea of what the movie's like a little bit, what it was shot like. Other parts of the movie take place with Cuban families, with Cuban workers living in poverty. And then it also follows some of the Cuban communists who were living in Havana, some of the academics. Um, and academics actually at the time, or the communist parties at the time were split. You know, they didn't know whether they should support Fidel and Che and their revolutionary war, or if they should pursue electoral politics, if they should try and vote for communist candidates. So actually a lot of the communists in Cuba, when Che and Fidel launched their revolution, were against the revolutionary struggle. But obviously, once it was seen that the revolutionary struggle may be successful, they hopped on board. There's a really incredible scene where one of the Cuban communists wants to shoot Batista's chief of police, but he can't. He can't shoot Batista's chief of police. He can't bring himself to do it because the chief of police is eating with his family. He's eating with his 2 kids and his wife. And I was sitting there watching the movie with one of my comrades, and I told them, like, that's crazy because Che would have done it. Che Guevara is like my hero, you know, he's my idol, but he would have shot the chief of police because he would have seen it as necessary for the overall struggle, right? Even though it was individually like a horrible act of killing this person in front of his family. Yeah, and it really makes you question, you know, like it really makes you think about revolution, right? And what revolutions actually are, where you have these people living in luxury, exploiting the Cuban people for their labor and exploiting Cuban women for their bodies in Havana, Cuba, while doing no actual labor, providing nothing to society. And then the masses of society are working under them, exploited under them, forced to sell their bodies for sex under them. And it's like the only way to take power then, and the only way to overthrow this horrific system is violence, is doing things that, you know, on an individual moral level may seem terrible. And there's a really good scene where after Batista's chief of police have killed some of the Cuban communists, a lot of their main, you know, comrades and people who were active in the struggle, after Batista's police crack down, one of the communists picks up a dove, and the dove is dead. And the Cuban people are having like an uprising in the streets, and he walks with the dead dove towards the chief of police. And then the chief of police and the policemen start spraying them with hoses and shooting at them. And it was incredibly powerful symbolism. The dead dove symbolizing that peace is not an option. Right? If we try and take power peacefully, if we try and educate people and vote for people who will overthrow this system, the police are going to kill us. The state, the armed bodies of the state who serve the capitalist class are going to suppress the socialist workers movement and prevent them from overthrowing the system. So the only option that the Cuban people had was violent struggle, was revolutionary struggle, and that was symbolized by the Cuban people walking towards the police with the dead dove, and then being put down by police violence and police brutality. And then there are also scenes like Cuban families who live in the fields and whose livelihoods are... Oh, thank you for the subscription. Thank you so much for your support, Forces Bill. But there are Cuban families working in the fields, and that's their whole livelihood, right? So they don't necessarily want to join the revolution, right? They're like, oh, you know, life isn't great for us as the peasants, you know, but we don't necessarily want to join this struggle and risk our lives to change how things work in Cuba. And then the U.S. launches a bombing campaign and drops bombs all over the Cuban peasants' fields and you know, kills family members of Cuban peasants. And it shows how that drives people to then join the struggle, right? That drives people to pick up a rifle and start fighting for liberation, because you see the oppression of capital. You see the lengths that capital is willing to go to oppress the working class. You know, and class consciousness and solidarity are built between the Cuban people in that struggle against imperialism and the ruling class. So, I mean, incredible movie as far as symbolism and as far as like Marxist talking about, or as far as a movie having Marxist themes goes. It's pretty incredible. I don't know if I have a critique of the movie. I mean, it's a little slow, right? It's like 2 hours. It's like 2.5 hours, black and white. Obviously subtitled if you don't speak Spanish. So it gets slightly slow, but I mean it's an old movie, right? So just maybe have something else to do or someone to talk to while you're watching it. That's what I had. But great movie, great film. I'd love to learn more about it. I'd love to learn how it was made. I know it was produced in conjunction with the Soviet Union. So ever since the 20s, the Soviets, or even maybe since the revolution in 1917, but I know by the 20s, the Soviets had a state film studio. They were producing films, obviously Marxist themed films. So I think this movie was made in cooperation with the Soviets to help tell the story of the Cuban Revolution, and help explain why this struggle was necessary and show how the Americans, the imperialists and the capitalists and their crony Batista would suppress the workers unless they led a revolutionary struggle. That the workers were going to be put down by the armed bodies of the state who served capital unless they were to arm themselves and struggle for something else. Struggle to overthrow the ruling class. So, yeah, that's the story of the Cuban Revolution, partially. I mean, it's the story of the Cuban Revolution without, actually following Che and Fidel, right? Without following the two people who we associate with the Cuban Revolution, but it also makes you think about the way that liberals look at history and the way that liberalism kind of forces you to look at history in this sort of great man of history point of view, right? This idea that history is driven by the leaders of countries. So by example, this is maybe how liberals would tell the story of Cuba. You had Batista, this dictator who was running the country like a gangster, and then Che and Fidel overthrew him in a revolution, and then Fidel led the country after that, and he was a dictator too. That's how liberals would look at it, rather than looking at the class forces that were at play. Rather than looking at the mass of Cuban peasants who were willing to fight in a revolution because of how oppressive and exploitative the Cuban ruling class was. Right? Che and Fidel were important, but they were just two guys, right? When the Granma, the Cuban, or the yacht or boat that Che and Fidel took to begin the revolution landed, and they were attacked by Batista's police, they only had 12 people after that. They started the revolution with 12 people. But when they started going around to the peasants and arming the peasants were ready to have a revolution because of the class makeup of Cuba. Because Cuba was so exploitative for the benefit of capitalists and gangsters and those who were close to Batista and the U.S. government at the expense of the Cuban peasants. Right? That was what drove history and made history change. Che and Fidel played a role. Batista played a role. But there were so many other elements, and there were so many other people, and there were so many different class forces at play that are as important as what Che, Fidel, and Batista did. And you see how the Marxist method of analyzing history is superior to the liberal method of analyzing history, right? You have to look at the class forces. You have to look at the superstructure, the state, and the legal system, and how it functions, and how the working class or the revolutionary element of society or the peasantry can struggle against those apparatuses of the state in order to struggle against capital, and that's how history moves, is classes struggling against other classes, in relation to what the laws and structures are at that time. And these class struggles lead those laws and structures to change over time. So, it reminds me of that quote, like, once you study history for long enough, you either become a Marxist or a liar. Right? Like, you either have to accept the liberal narrative of history that great men, great rulers are the ones who are leading historical events to happen, or you adopt the Marxist method and understand that there are different opposed elements who struggle against each other and cause different political and legal and economic structures to change.